Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming for this talk by Wolfgang Sporrer, who is a faculty member at the Hertie School in Berlin, though he insisted on pointing out that he is Austrian and not German. He is also the former head of the Human Dimension Department at the OSCE mission in Kiev, where he led the civilian aspects of conflict management in Ukraine and facilitated and promoted dialogue between the opposing sides. He also served as a political advisor in the EU delegation in Moscow and in several roles for the OSCE, the EU, and the private sector in the Balkans and the Caucasus. He studied law at the University of Vienna, studied at the London School of Economics, and most importantly, he is also an alum of Johns Hopkins SAIS. And today he will be talking to us about the Minsk agreement or the Minsk process. So, Wolfgang, the floor is yours. As always, the talk will be for about 35 minutes, and then we will open it up to the Q&A.
Thank you, Eugene. So let's delve right into it. Because we can't speak about Minsk when we don't understand a couple of fundamentals. And I know you all get taught probably about the pre-war history of Ukraine that is both between 2014 and 2022, but also pre-2014. But just that we're all on the same page, I wanted to start by talking about the Maidan Revolution, which by some people is called Revolution of Dignity, whereas others have other names for it. Other people call it a putsch on the more radical side. So what was the Maidan? I was in Kiev when the Maidan happened, and I'm going to give you, apart from academic observations, which you can, read in many fantastic books and journals, a couple of words about the Maidan. First of all, what was it for and what was it against? The first question is really hard to answer. The second question is super easy to answer. The Maidan was not against Russia. The Maidan was not against Eastern Ukraine. The Maidan was against President Yanukovych. Mainly, again, my narrative, not on the grounds that Yanukovych was a pro-Russian president, although that was also a factor, but mainly on the grounds that Yanukovych and his entire regime were grotesquely corrupt, and little protests that originally began in support of the of association with the EU and were carried by students, young intellectuals, the group that usually nobody listens to. This was then enlarged to a true mass movement. Some of that mass movement most wanted more freedoms, less corruption, particularly more chances, more European values and potentially orientation. So while it was very easy, and some part also wanted a Ukraine that is firmly anchored in a European, potentially anti-Russian geopolitical system. These are small groups. So my point here is the Maidan was a very broad movement encompassing a lot of people, a lot of opinions, united by the fact that they wanted to get rid of Yanukovych. The second question about the Maidan I want to ask is, it was a mass movement. That was a true mass movement. If you in a city like Kiev, which has 3.5, 4 million inhabitants, if you have 1 million people on the street, that's a mass movement. That's a true mass movement. Was the Maidan a completely non-violent movement? That is not the case, but it was not an army. There were things that were set on fire. There were buildings that were being smashed. There were people who were being put in trash cans violently. But it was never a militarized movement, ever. It was not a non-violent movement, but never militarized, and a true mass movement. So now to that pesky question, when you always hear the word putsch from some circles. The truth behind this matter is it's not a matter of putting a label what that was. What this Maidan in essence was constitutionally. We may have some constitutional lawyers, hang it lower, not constitutional scholars. It was what is often called a constitutional discontinuity. Mr. Yanukovych left the country, and the Ukrainian constitution had perfect provisions, like any good constitution, like the American constitution, like the Austrian constitution. What happens when the president dies? What's the succession? What happens when he resigns? What happens? What happens if he is incapacitated? It's all written in the constitution. What was not written in the constitution is what happens when the president just leaves the country. Brackets, probably welcome by the majority of Ukrainians, and still from abroad claims, I'm still president, but I'm not coming back. So that was a moment on which the Ukrainian constitution was not really prepared. So what happened there, the appointment of the interim president, was not done as written in the constitution, but this Maidan Revolution that had such a huge popular support, at least Kiev, Central, Western, also even in the Eastern Ukraine, had no other choice because the constitution just didn't leave any fully constitutional path forward. One word to the shootings, because it's an interesting thing. Many of you will know that on the Maidan, more than 100 people, Maidan supporters, were shot by so far unknown individuals, right? I had the pleasure or the displeasure of following that case, that so-called Maidan case, in court at the Kiev District Court. That case has been dragging on now for 9 years without much progress. The real perpetrators have not been found, and the topic has become so politicized that one version of the event serves as a foundation of it's basically a foundation of a narrative for one side, and the other version of events works as a foundation of a narrative for the other side. So that is really one of these foundational myths of the Maidan that may remain shrouded in mystery for the forthcoming time. Now, there were Ukrainians, particularly in the East. And when I say East, I mean the provinces of Dnipro, at the time Dnipropetrovsk, in Donetsk, in Lugansk, and in Kharkiv, at the time Kharkov, as the locals called it, who were very much opposed to the Maidan. Influenced by Russian propaganda, for sure, but their rejection of the Maidan government, particularly the element that said Ukraine should be more looking west and less looking towards Moscow, did not sit well with many people there. I'm not talking about majorities. I'm not talking about, I don't know, but with a lot of people. These people were then instrumentalized by the Russian Federation to organize the so-called anti-Maidan. And the so-called anti-Maidan was very different from the Maidan. The so-called anti-Maidan was not a mass movement. It was never a mass movement. The largest demonstrations in Donetsk, I was there at the time, had 5,000 people. 5,000 people in a city of 900,000, a million, nobody really knows. That is not a mass movement. It's not a mass movement at all. That's a minority program. But these guys were very violent and very early and very easily militarized. Very early and very easily militarized. First carrying sticks with nails, which is not a nice weapon. Sticks with nails in them. Next day carrying handguns. Next day carrying, big weapons, and in a week having access to artillery. Yeah, so highly militarized, not a mass movement, but intent on taking over the east of Ukraine. They found no opposition from the local Ukrainian security actors. The police was cooperating to a large degree with them. And they took on and on and on and on, one building after building. They took down the Ukrainian flag and replaced it with something else. That something else was sometimes some kind of made up flag. Sometimes it was a Russian flag. Sometimes it was a flag of the Confederate South, very popular at the time. So it was a big mess. But Ukraine was losing sovereignty over these territories, basically with no resistance, either by the population or by the authorities or by the security forces, like at all, because the government was so weak. I just explained you how they came into power. They were, their hold on power was really tenuous. Their legitimacy was extremely tenuous. So they couldn't send the army. They just said, listen, let's have elections. Okay, then we had elections 25th of May 2014, at which Poroshenko won, right? Poroshenko had a resounding victory. So there was the legitimacy, and then the conflict started, right? The real conflict started. Now let's go one step further and let's look at the origins of the conflict. When I speak about the origins of the conflict, the first thing I would like to say is that the main reason for the conflict that we have right now is the Russian aggression against Ukraine. If there would not have been the Russian aggression against Ukraine, there would be no conflict, right? But no conflict is without a context. No conflict is without a context. And I would like to explain this to you, the Ukrainian conflict, in a way that my former boss explained it to me. He was a former Turkish deputy foreign minister and a very smart IR practitioner. And he said, the Ukrainian conflict has three concentric circles. The inner circle is an inner Ukrainian conflict, an intra-Ukrainian conflict. Sometimes it's characterized as an East-West conflict that is very imprecise because it's just too much simplification, but it's among people, mainly the East, who have historically looked at their main direction to Russia. And people in Western Ukraine, many of them in Western, who have historically looked either to Kiev or further west for the, let's say, intellectual center. Russian mother tongue versus Ukrainian mother tongue has a little bit to do with it. I will posit here that your religion has nothing to do with it, because many Ukrainians don't even know whether they belong to which patriarchate of the church they actually belong to. But it has a lot to do with World War World War II. Sorry, saying World War. I always used to joke before this joke became too tragic to make, that if a country can't agree, if they lost or won World War II, you can see signs of trouble, and that is really the case. Partially, Ukrainians regard themselves as great winners of World War II. They were part of the winning of the historical, of the, heroic Soviet army. That was the historical narrative for decades. Others, because they defeated Nazi Germany, others said, we were on the losing side. We lost our independence. We lost our independence. We were occupied by the Soviet Union. We were occupied by Stalin. So this narrative about World War II is another very, I would say, splitting element in Ukrainian society. Let me put a little parenthesis here. This is not the only country that has these problems. It's not. How split are the United States? How split is Germany? Also about historical narrative. So that's not, but it's there, That's the innermost circle. The second circle is the bilateral circle between Russia and Ukraine. The bilateral circle between Russia and Ukraine is built partially on mutual, at least in the past, on mutual dependencies, which is never really good for feeling very much at ease with your, with colleagues. Russia to this day, for all the gas they export to the West, which is not that much anymore, it's still a big chunk, is still dependent on Ukraine to transit that gas. I mean, imagine that. During the current situation, Ukraine transits Russian gas and lets it flow freely and nicely get transit fees from Gazprom, which is also interesting. Of course, also there you have narratives of history, Russian, Ukrainian. Prince Vladimir, was he a Russian? Was he a Ukrainian? Of course, to me, these debates seem interesting because obviously he wasn't either, because he was a representative of a state that died of the Kiev Rus. So, but there is this economic and historical Russian-Ukrainian dimension. But there is also an East-West dimension. An East-West dimension that I've here illustrated by a quote from my former professor at science, by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said it cannot be stressed enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine, supported and subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Is it in the interest of Russia to be an empire? You bet. Is it in the interest of the United States for Russia not to become an empire? Oh, yeah. So here we have this international dimension, the larger geopolitical dimension, very much. But I want to stress again on the end of this slide that none of these factors in my analysis would have been strong enough to ignite the war if it would not have been for Putin's aggression. I think that's just very important to remember. You can explain, you can understand, but this is not an excuse. This may be a certain explanation, but it's far from an excuse. Yeah. So, Maidan is over. What happened in Minsk? How did we come from the Maidan to Minsk? I told you what happened. Ukraine loses part of its territory with no resistance, basically. Just retreat. The rebels take over. These ragtag rebels. Nobody knows who they are. They wear masks. We know that many of them were Ukrainians. Many of them were Russians. But what we do know now is that the command and control likely came from the Russian Federation. This is quite clear. So what happens? Poroshenko says, let's have the Ukrainian army advance. Let's beat these guys. We need to do an anti-terrorist operation because we want to reestablish territorial, integrity of the country. It's very legitimate. But the army advances, and the exact opposite of today happened. Namely, the Ukrainian army turned out to be completely incapable. Their tanks did not work. The soldiers had no shoes, no uniforms. they didn't support the government. Whole units basically didn't only capitulate, they sort of dissolved. It was a logistical military disaster, this campaign in 2014 for the new Ukrainian Poroshenko government. So that then led to diplomacy stepping in and the signature of the Minsk Protocol, which was the first kind of ceasefire arrangement in October 2014. War goes on, and then the leaders meet again. Which leaders? Mrs. Angela Merkel, Mr. François Hollande, Mr. Putin, and Mr. Poroshenko, hosted by a neutral host, Mr. Lukashenko of Belarus, would also take place differently today. The reality of these negotiations was, unfortunately, I put the slide already up. I remember I went. I was not in Minsk for this round, but I had a person sitting there in the ante room, and they started. I think at 10 in the. I started at 10 in the morning, and so by 1 or 2, I called and said, "Sir, are they out?" No, they're not out. By 8, I called again. Are they out? No, they're not out. They're still in there. All the 4 leaders, right? The presidents, the leaders, they were all still there with only translators present. Nobody else but translators, right? And with Heidi Tagliavini, which is I'll talk about that later, which was the ambassador in charge of doing the deal. So I went to bed around 11:30, 12, and they were still in. In the morning, they were still in. They came out around 1300 hours. So these 4 guys were sitting there for like 28 hours. For 28 hours. As an anecdote told by this ambassador to me, I will not vouch for the veracity of this story, but it was told by a person who was actually there. Approximately from 2 to 5, Mr. Poroshenko and Mr. Hollande went to sleep. Whereas Mr. Putin and Mrs. Merkel, they stayed up and negotiated all through the night. I have no idea if that's true, by the way. Story told to me by somebody who was there. And they came out with the so-called package of measures. Was the quality of the agreement affected by the negotiation process? Of course, which quality is not affected by the negotiation process? It's the quality of the agreement is determined in the process. Take a look at the agreement, just as just 5 minutes. This all was followed the next day, and this is often forgotten. Next day, they signed the agreement, and here I will go to the agreement. We have the original text of the agreement. You don't need to read it all. It's okay. I just put it here. That's all, by the way. It's 2 pages. It's not much, huh? Not much. So this was followed. This was signed, and the next day, we can now really say the Russian army. We always used to say the rebels, but there were rebels there, but it was heavily guided by the Russian army, started an attack to annex territory from Ukraine in the city of Debaltsevo. No, it will not tell much to you. But the next day, one of the signatures, be it the rebels or be it Putin, not even important for that particular story, already did the biggest violation of the Minsk agreements in terms of territorial control that ever happened, right? So that happened. So let's now look what we were sitting over for many colleagues and me over the next 8 years, 7 years. Let's take a look at the Minsk agreements. What's in them? Have you, anyone of you has read the Minsk agreements already? No. You have read them. It's been a while. Okay, let's go through them very kind of, soberly and see what's been implemented and what's not been implemented. Then I will give you also my comments on who I believe was mainly behind implementation or non-implementation. So here we go. We have the first point. Can you read a little bit? Just go on, nothing. Can we just? Usually I do the enlarge thing on the computer. Yeah, that's much better. Yeah.
Which point do you want to?
But I want to just go point by point by point.
Okay.
Okay, so, okay, super. So, immediate and a comprehensive ceasefire to certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's Minsk speak for rebel-occupied territories. Did this ever happen? Who thinks it happened? Never happened. There were some days with a little bit less, but I think we had no day with no ceasefire violations. This was largely the responsibility, in my view, of the rebels and of the Russian Federation, who was directing the rebels. Withdrawal of heavy weapons by both sides on equal distances in order to create a security zone. Did this ever happen? Never happened. Again, the ones who blockaded the ceasefire also blockaded the withdrawal of heavy weapons. Ensure effective monitoring by the OSCE. That happened. We reported publicly on a daily basis, but we reported the violations. Launch a dialogue. This is a nice one. Can you read it? Launch a dialogue on day one of the withdrawal on modalities of local elections and agree with Ukrainian legislation and the law of Ukraine on interim blah, blah, blah. So a dialogue should happen on day one of the withdrawal. Did that ever happen? That never happened. Who refused to have that dialogue? Ukraine refused to have that dialogue. First of all, claiming rightly that there is no ceasefire, so we cannot have a proper dialogue. So that dialogue never took place. Now, point 5. That's an amazing point. Ensure pardon and amnesty by enacting a law prohibiting the prosecution and punishment of persons in connection with events, blah, 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 with everything that happened in Ukraine. So full amnesty for all the rebels, all the little green men, for everybody. Now, I always look, when I read this point 6 of the Minsk, 5 of the Minsk agreements, and I always get one question from my students in Berlin. What would that question be? How can Ukrainians have signed this? How did they sign something? That's crazy. I don't know, I wasn't there, but they signed it. Point 6, ensure release and exchange of all hostages and unlawfully detained persons. That was implemented. I mean, needless to say, that point 5 was never implemented, and it was from the very beginning obstructed by Ukraine to implement this point 5 from the very beginning. There was never even debate. Point 6 actually happened. There were prisoners exchanges. Ensure safe access humanitarian aid. That happened partially. The Ukrainian side actually allowed humanitarian aid. They were very cooperative on humanitarian aid. The rebel side was incooperative and obstructive and basically actively working against their own people there on this one. ensure safe access, delivery, so humanitarian aid, we had that. And now comes the most important part. Definition of modalities of full resumption of socio-economic ties, including social transfers, such as pensions, payments and other payments, blah, 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 economic reintegration. Did this ever happen? Never happened. Who was behind the non-integration, the non-implementation of point 8? Very strongly Ukraine. Very strongly Ukraine. Again, with an argument that is not absurd. The argument by Ukraine always was, we cannot send pensions to the other side of the contact line because we'd be financing our enemy. We would be financing terrorism. We will close this off. I understand this from a logical point of view, yet it's in direct contravention, particularly the non-payment of pensions, 2.9 of the Minsk agreements, 0.8. Now comes another one. The reinstatement of full control over the state border. Yeah, Ukraine gets back control of the state border by the government of Ukraine throughout its conflict area, starting on day 1 after local elections, right? So these special elections, and this we can read in conjunction with point 12. Yeah. Based on the law in Ukraine, interim local self-government, there will be discussions on local elections. Now, this proved to be the most contentious part of this agreement. The Russian Federation and the rebels said, look at the agreement. We can only talk about the state border. It's written here, day 1, after local elections. Whereas was the Ukrainian position, more or less from the get-go, that Ukraine will not debate local elections without first having full control over the state border. I let that stand here. That's it. So that's in essence the Minsk agreements. And as we said, at the end, not one point, except the exchange of hostages, was actually properly implemented. And the OSCE, I do not, and the monitoring by the OSCE was properly implemented, was indeed properly implemented. Now, did I want to go to the results. Results, Fragezeichen, this results question mark. Yeah. So was the Minsk process useless? Was it a useless process? Well, it was not. It was far from useless. So the result, the narrative that the Minsk process was useless and had no results is very, very false. And I will tell you why. First of all, prisoners' exchanges were negotiated in Minsk. Lives were saved. Families were reunited. Hundreds, in thousands, hundreds. Second, humanitarian ceasefires and ceasefires around humanitarian infrastructure were negotiated basically on a weekly basis. There would be a humanitarian ceasefire around Donetsk water filtration station so that the water supply to Donetsk will not fail and deprive 1 million people of water. That worked. It worked not once, that worked on a number of occasions. Many temporary ceasefires. That was the idea of the two chairs who were extremely seasoned diplomats, Ambassador Seidig and Ambassador Abakan. He said, they don't want a ceasefire, but maybe we can get little ceasefire. Let's do a ceasefire for the harvest. Let's do a ceasefire for beginning of school, 2 days. Let's do a ceasefire for sewing. Let's do a ceasefire for St. Patrick's Day. I'm joking, but it was really, it's maybe not appropriate for a joke, but the idea was to establish so many little ceasefires after an hour, all for a special reason, that people will get kind of think at some point, why are we starting again? And that worked. That worked. We had periods of extremely low fighting, even months-long periods, where we had, double-digit ceasefire violations a day, which is nothing, which is, it's basically calm. I want to mention the Stanica Luganska bridge repair because it was my personal biggest kind of deal that I did there. That was the only bridge that connected government-controlled and non-government controlled areas in Luhansk Oblast, in Luhansk region. Thousands of people crossing daily under the most horrendous circumstances. They had to climb ladders, 80-year-old climbing rickety wooden ladders. And both sides were absolutely disinterested in repairing this. Yes, they didn't want traffic over this contact line. There was no interest in this. But then there was a window of opportunity. And that window of opportunity was when Zelensky came to power in, Eugene, help me, May 2018, 2019. Zelensky, I can attest to this. He came with the, many would say naive, I would not say naive, I would say very sincere intention of delivering on Minsk, of actually making peace with the Russians, of making peace with the rebels. And that's when the Russians didn't want to give him a win. They obstructed everything that Zelensky did. Everything in Minsk, outside of Minsk. They didn't want to give him this win because they didn't like him for reasons that will lead beyond 7 minutes. Huh? I still come to the and at the result, and this is still there, of this little honeymoon period in Minsk, was that they repaired this bridge. Zelensky opened it, and it's a huge humanitarian. It was a huge humanitarian step in the right direction, progress, right? I don't know if this bridge still exists or if it has been destroyed again in this iteration of this war. Then I want to come to 2 other things. First of all, the negotiations in Minsk had a very important early warning function. When you meet each week, you get to know each other. And you say, look, listen, our leadership is extremely unhappy with what's going on here. And I'm not sure how long I can. Can we please talk about this? Can we talk about that? So that's avoiding of escalation. But of course, political solution did not come. Instead came the Russian attack. So results, the reasons for the failure of Minsk, that we go through that very quickly. First of all, there was no political will due to different expectations. The agreement was a false agreement. The agreement acted. The agreement pretended that there was an oppressed Russian minority in Donetsk and Lugansk that needed autonomy. This is a false narrative. They were not oppressed, and not more oppressed or less oppressed, or this was just a pretense. Most of the people there did not feel oppressed by Kiev. They didn't. And therefore they deserve it. That's the basis of the Minsk documents, right? Ceasefire for autonomy. It's a classic, right? The real reason for the conflict was a different one. The real reason for the conflict, again, in my opinion, this is not, the wisdom from the sky, is that with an increasingly pro-European and anti-Russian Ukraine, Russia wanted a foothold over what Kiev can and cannot do. And what better of having your own little controlled statelets, Donetsk and Lugansk, to basically enter into Ukrainian politics and wreak havoc there. That's what Russia wanted. And that's what Ukraine never wanted. So that's why this agreement had different expectations and didn't work. Secondly, it was a technically really bad agreement. No sequencing, therefore different interpretations, as we talked about. Security and political, what comes first? Election versus border control, what comes first? Very weak verification mechanisms, basically none, except a little bit of OSCE. And there was, and we need to talk about this at least today, because this Western split is something I see coming up, very strongly, very soon again, over the implementation, where you had basically the world united in pressuring Russia on the implementation of the Minsk agreements. That was one of the principles for sanctions to be lifted, right? So Europe was very split in how far Ukraine should actually be told to implement these Minsk agreements. There were some European countries that said, yes, actually, it would be really good if we had these implemented. And there were some European countries who thought we can never have peace with Russia. The more it shows by these agreements not being implemented, the better. I will not name individual names of countries, but as you're students of IR at SAIS, I think you can do that yourself. And then two extremely mundane reasons, but which I believe are huge reasons for the war breaking out as it did. Minsk, the groups in Minsk, the Trilateral Contact Group, could not meet anymore since the end of 2019. That means this entire early warning function was gone. This entire trust building function, which was very much there, that every week Kuchma talking to the high level Russian representative, very open, over coffee, in the garden, over cigarette. That fell apart. COVID wrecked this process more than anything else. And also because of that, because of COVID, the OSCE SMM could not monitor anymore. And also because of that, stopped providing an independent factual basis for what actually to talk about. So Minsk very much was also torpedoed by COVID. You can't really say that. Was very much also impacted by the COVID pandemic, leading to the outbreak of this war. Now I will go to I don't want to put this next slide out, but I want to more kind of discuss this with you. So that's water under the bridge, right? But I think it's water under the bridge that's kind of relevant to understand. How can we get out of this? It's not a mess. It's a gigantic tragedy. There are two views to this war. And I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. There's the view from above. The view from above looks at the military situation, looks at the legal situation, and looks at the military, legal, and at the moral situation. If you have that view from above, it's extremely clear who is at fault and what should be done. Namely, if morals should prevail, if law should prevail, Ukraine must win this conflict. At least Russia must lose it decisively. That's the view from above. Or you can adopt a view from below. And I want to introduce you today maybe to a view from below, where you do not have big moral principles and states mainly as actors, but individual human beings, and look for a pragmatic solution, how to minimize human suffering. It's, if you have studied that very much, I think the ethics of morals versus the ethics of responsibility, which are different types of ethic, right? From whose perspective do we look? Do we look from the one who is on the sides, or do we look from the guy who is weak and is basically subject to the decisions? Currently, both sides reject negotiations. Zelensky has issued a decree forbidding himself to negotiate with Putin. Plus, they have made completely impossible advance demands. Basically, Ukrainian advance demands are all of Ukraine, including Crimea, must be left, and then we can talk. Okay. The Russians have also made completely impossible demands, preconditions, saying we can talk once the Ukrainians accept that we occupy their country. Okay, we can spare that, right? So both sides right now reject and exclude de facto negotiations. Even worse, both sides, I will posit to you that both sides at the moment think they're becoming stronger. Ukraine thinks they're becoming stronger because they're now getting the Leopards. I don't want to go into this debate unless if you want to ask whether this is good or bad or right or wrong. It's going to be a long answer, I warn you. But they think they're becoming stronger. They're getting more weapons. That's it. That's why they think they're becoming stronger. Russia thinks they're becoming stronger in essence because, first of all, they have the possibility to mobilize more troops, either through a second round of mobilization or by keeping the conscripts, who are probably better than these mobilized soldiers, keeping these conscripts on the field. So that makes them stronger. And secondly, they're still thinking that the West will sooner or later, the more the cost rise, the West is going to give up on Ukraine, and then we got them. So also that is not a very good precondition for negotiations, right? If you think, you probably have learned the negotiation theory. What do you need? You need the mutually hurting stalemate. We don't have it. The mutually enticing opportunity. We don't have it. The painful pressure from outside. We don't have it. So that means a long war is ahead. And that's where mostly analysis and ends. I want to go, not where it ends, but where these talks end, unfortunately. I want to go a step further. And I want to say, what can negotiation do? So what is to be done? I think while sides, and here I'm talking about Russia and Ukraine, I kind of don't like to call them sides because it's some kind of equalization. I still will do that with your kind permission, because on that one they are. But people on both sides have great interest in negotiations. When you sit in the trenches in Bakhmut, on both sides of the contact line, by the way, it's horrendous. When you sit in an apartment block in Dnipro that is being bombarded, it's horrendous. But also it's horrendous when you sit in an apartment block in Donetsk or in Makeivka, which is on the other side of the line. That is also not a pleasant feeling. When you sit in Kiev, you have no electricity, you don't know how to get it. It's a horrendous human cost. But the human cost does not end there. Of course, the human cost is the highest for Ukraine. the highest for Ukraine. I think nothing comes for a long time, right? But the entire world is suffering from the conflict. The global South is suffering through higher food prices in ways that are directly connected to the conflict. Famines in Somalia, famines in Madagascar, a depletion of state budgets in Egypt. You're even suffering when you are sitting in New Zealand or in Australia because you pay much higher for your LNG suddenly. You're suffering when you sit in Western Europe and suddenly, and not everybody is rich or well off, and suddenly your gas doesn't cost 100 euros, but 400 or 500 euros a month. For pensioners, this is a disaster. So the suffering, while Ukraine is very much impacted most, is global suffering. So the global costs of the war, and particularly of a further extended war, are not to be underestimated. I don't want to even go for the potential geopolitical, what that means of the rise of China, etc., etc. So, yeah. So what can be done? I think what can be done is to try to extend the Istanbul Grain Initiative, in which both sides should enter after the West communicates robustly to Ukraine and China communicates robustly to Russia, to actually enter into some kind of mini negotiations. While fighting is ongoing, just like they do in Istanbul. In Istanbul, Ukrainians and Russians are sitting together and are talking about grain deliveries. They're just not talking about much else but grain deliveries. So I think if Russia, if Turkey and China go to Russia and say, we really want you to participate. The West goes to Ukraine, we really want you to participate. Don't make any concessions yet. Just sit there. Humanitarian ceasefires around holidays, around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Please negotiate about that. Around hospitals, just one bombed yesterday. This could be avoided, easily avoided. So that would have three advantages. First of all, humanitarian advantages, less people get killed. Secondly, an early warning function, as we talked about. When people sit together, there are less surprises than when they don't sit together. And thirdly, trust building, because whatever comes, we will need a certain tiny modicum of trust. So start small, but start what you can. The Istanbul Grain Initiative has given us the opportunity. Mediator can, by the way, never be Europe or the US. Russia views them as a party to the war. Finally, you may see that, well, all the things, well, Russia will use the time to rearm, etc., etc. But diplomacy and peacemaking is mostly, not also sometimes, but mostly the art of applying patches rather than the art of finding perfect solutions. So I think that's what we should try also in the context of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's open it up for the Q&A. As in always, the first question goes to a student. So Omar.
First of all, thank you very much for this enjoyable talk, Professor. And by the way, your style of speaking reminds me of Orson Welles, which is a good compliment, I think.
As long as it's only the style of speaking.
But I wanted to ask you. Well, I wanted to make just a couple of one comment and a question.
Sure.
So the first thing about the pardoning of militants in conflict when there is a ceasefire agreement, that's actually a very common thing, because it's what motivates militants
Yeah.
to stop fighting.
Yeah.
Most of the time, militants won't have the motivation to stop fighting if the ceasefire doesn't include something like that.
Yeah.
And second of all, what do you think of the statements made recently by Hollande and Merkel, that when they said that the only reason they negotiated these agreements was to give Ukraine time to build up its army? And how do you think that affects the Western negotiating position as far as being arbiters, future arbiters of a negotiation?
Okay, on your first point, on the amnesty, I have nothing to add. You're completely right. It's a common clause in ceasefire agreements, particularly in peace agreements, by the way, not so much in ceasefire agreements, but which Minsk is not. But this needs to be accompanied. Yeah, sorry. No. This needs to be accompanied by a rhetoric that kind of reflects that. When I go and sign this in Minsk, and then I go out and say these people are all terrorists and should all be killed, there is a contradiction that is not helpful. Which was in the case, this at the Ukraine is basically trying to hide this from the public. In a way, I mean, they didn't hide it obviously, but they didn't advertise that they signed this. Secondly, the comments by Merkel and Hollande. I mean, what is, of course, the case is that the European Union had no role, neither in the Minsk nor in the Normandy processes. The European Union had outsourced their Ukraine policy to France and Germany. That they said, okay, we cannot do this. Our high representative is not being, she is not, strong enough. We will outsource this to France and Germany. I happen to be at some Normandy foreign, not at the heads level, at the political directors level. I honestly never had the impression that they were not, that France and Germany were not seriously trying to make progress to a ceasefire. I mean, maybe that was one strategic objective, to allow the Ukrainians, but I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, if Ukraine, and I don't know if Eugene would disagree with me, because it's kind of a historical theorizing around, if Ukraine would have not signed the Minsk agreements, they would have lost this 2014 when they were in a militarily horrendous position. They just had lost the major battle of Ilovaisk. They had lost the major battle of Saur-Mogila, if you remember, if you're like an expert on this. They had nothing. So yes, it bought them time. It bought them time. But I would not go so far, at least I have not observed anything that France or Germany were basically obstructing the meeting. I have not, because, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I have a follow-up question on that kind of, because Zelensky was like elected in 2019 also on the premise to implement Minsk, and but he would have needed like US support to actually go through also domestic opposition there. So why actually did the US not do more to push forward for the implementation of Minsk when it was still more achievable?
Again, you're asking me a hypothetical question, and I'm also not a real expert on US foreign policy. But I can tell you that what you're saying is that Zelensky really came into that with verve and with force, with a wish to actually get peace and actually get an implementation of the Minsk agreement. I don't think that was the case. I think that was a very, 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 do agree with you that his main that basically the entire pro-European elite in Ukraine was against this. They were also, today, this is very little known, they were all against Zelensky. All of the young, urban, English-speaking, civil society, wonderful Ukrainian intellectuals, a vast majority of them were against Zelensky. And Zelensky at some point realized that he will actually need these elites. And the prize for that, part of that prize, was surely to cave on a policy that was regarded as weak, as pro-Russian, and as a policy on implementing Minsk. Did the US strongly lean on Zelensky to do it, to like implement Minsk? I have not seen it. I don't know. But about the motivations of the Trump administration, to speculate about the motivation of the Trump administration is always a kind of a tricky thing to do, right? So that's my answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and if you are in the Zoom land and have a question, then please put your questions in the Q&A box. I don't see any right now, but if you have those, then that's time.
Thank you, Professor. I was actually wrong. I had not read the Minsk agreement previously. It was the Budapest Memorandum. And so so first of all, I would have lost sleep if I didn't.
I hear it says, I'm joking.
I would have lost sleep if I didn't clarify that. So along those lines, what role did obviously the Budapest Memorandum didn't really hold up either. Is there a connection between, well, other than the obvious invasion of Ukraine in 2014, is there a connection between the failings of the Budapest Memorandum and then the failings of the Minsk agreement in other ways? It seems to be a pattern. I mean, you know, two sorts of agreements not holding up, and is there, can you speak about maybe a connection between the two?
Yeah, I could speak about the connection
But
between.
just a second, for the sake of those who are not familiar with all the agreements, could you please say a sentence or two about what Budapest is?
Okay, the Budapest Memorandum was an international document. I don't believe it was a treaty, an international document that was signed between the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Ukraine in 1994. It foresaw that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons and in exchange get security guarantees for this kind of for the effort to divest themselves of their nuclear weapons. Now, there's two things one needs to know, because this is so often presented so wrongly and so short. Ukraine never actually had these nuclear weapons. These were Soviet nuclear weapons that were on Ukrainian territory, but Ukraine did not have the capacity to control them or to operate them or to do anything with them. So it was a pretty easy thing to give up. Please keep this in mind when you know about Budapest Memorandum. And then there was, when the time came in 2014, that actually Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation, that the Donbass was stealthily undermined by rebels and by the Russian Federation. It was never so clear that Russia actually attacked Ukraine. You know? It was never, there was never a headline, Russia attacks Ukraine on CNN. Little green men creep up in Crimea. At some point, Putin 1.5 years later says, yeah, these were ours. Rebels kind of occupy houses, but never was the moment where I say, Russia attacks Ukraine. Also, the Budapest Memorandum, so that there was nothing really to fully trigger it. at the time. But some people have also said the legal validity is not a legal document, although I think it is a legal document. So there was also some questions around the actual, legal international law meaning of that document. And at the end of the day, also Ukraine didn't protest too much when nothing happened, except now. But now it was much too late for the Buddha. So it was a failed document. Why did it fail? Is there a parallel to Minsk? I think there is very, very, very little parallel to Minsk. Because to say the words, the beauty of Minsk is a little bit strange to say, but there was an implementation mechanism with Minsk. And that's what I just read to you. We meet every 3 weeks, every 2 weeks on this level, and in 4 working groups, and we talk. So all these functions, early warning, trust building, et cetera, that come with an institutionalization of a agreement was never there with Budapest Memorandum. But Kuchma, President Kuchma of Ukraine, said at some point to us that in his opinion, to sign the Budapest Memorandum was the biggest foreign policy mistake of his life.
Other questions? Yes, in the back. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. In today's world, information control is used as a mean to build the narrative. And so there was a law in Ukraine which was passed in 2019, which had mandated Ukraine as compulsory for the public servants of Ukraine. And this is...
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. In 2019,
Yeah.
there was a law passed
Yeah.
in Ukraine which had mandated Ukrainian for the public servants in Ukraine. Now, 30% of Ukraine does speak Russian, and such kind of laws are used by Russia to kind of prove that ethnic Russians are being marginalized. So, could you just comment on this?
Yes, I can comment with the fact that the Council of Europe has the so-called Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, which is kind of the very, very simplified, the human rights, minority rights body of the Council of Europe, has published a very, very critical opinion, of this law. Do I believe that this law has furthered the unity of Ukraine as a nation? I do not believe so. Did this law further Russian narratives, lying Russian narratives of Ukraine? Yes, it absolutely did. But did this law do what the Russians said? Even Lavrov said, in Ukraine, it's now forbidden to speak Russian. That is absolute nonsense. It has never been forbidden in Ukraine to speak Russian. In this context, sadly, the most renowned university in Ukraine, the so-called Kiev Mohyla Academy, just 2 or 3 days ago, they did the first real ban on using Russian on their campuses in teaching, but also outside among conversations among students. So there is, and this kind of goes to my wider point to the costs of the war. War in itself is such a horrendous phenomenon that the view from above on right and wrong and legal and illegal may not be enough, because many narratives that Putin has made about Ukraine, they will ban you from speaking Russian. This is the first incident that's actually is this a good development? I don't think. Is it very, very understandable? Yes, in the context of a war of aggression, this is understandable, but it's not a good development. but Russian was in Kiev and still is widely used in the streets, in restaurants, between people, still is widely used. When I go on the streets of Berlin and I feel you see Russian-speaking people, half of them are Ukrainians. So it's just like that, you know, it's a fact. And I said that Russian-speaking, the language issue in Ukraine is complicated. There are Russian language speaking, like Russian as first language, ultra-Ukrainian patriots, very much. The leader of one of these horrendous so-called republics of Lugansk Republic was actually from Chernivtsi, from the ultimate west of Ukraine. So that's only one of these many dividing or also uniting and dividing elements in a real kaleidoscope. I hope I made this clear that it's not, I mean, when you hear someone who says this is the conflict of Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers, you can off the TV.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
This might be a little simplistic. If you take a word made famous by Neville Chamberlain, capitulation, and you tie it into what you said, there are two views as to how to end the war. One was individual and one was by winning the war. If you look historically, and this is very simplistic, at Chechnya and Georgia and Crimea and Donbass, how could the Ukrainians be convinced that anything less than full liberation of the original territories would be anything less than giving the opposition time to rearm and enter again?
I believe to talk now about what should be the result of negotiations is the biggest trap you can fall into as a mediator. I teach mediation. Whenever I say, oh, yes, Ukraine, maybe at the end of the day, they should let go of this or that, or they say Ukraine never, ever. This is not for me to decide as a mediator. The most important thing is to start a process, small and small and small. The rest will be determined by natural dynamics, by the cost, which is, as I said, gigantic. And again, I think that also the people on the ground should have some kind of say where they actually want to live. It's very difficult. I'm not arguing for any kind of referendum or something, but I'm just saying, if I want to be, or if the UN wants to be, or if anybody wants to be successful in bringing the sides together, to bring out smaller humanitarian gains, to achieve a certain buildup of trust, to achieve a little bit of a reduction of the risk of escalation, which I believe is, by the way, very, very large and growing. If you want to have that, we will not go with a description of my desired end. That's the biggest trap. Whoever makes a comment on this will immediately be rejected by at least one of the sides. A negotiation is a process where the outcome is determined by the process and not by a mediator who says, okay, I mean, you can do it this way. When the Serbs and the Croats met in Dayton, Richard Holbrooke knew really well what would be in the final document, right? And he said, you look, either you sign here on the dotted line, or next day our F-16s are gonna come. But we do not, nobody has that type of power over Russia. And it would be, I think, extremely, extremely immoral to use that power the West has over Ukraine. So no comment on end result. Comment on steps how to get there, but no comment on end result.
Thank you. And the final question, Sean?
Thanks again. My question is just in the spirit of having these really small incremental meetings, talking about very basic ceasefires.
Yeah.
Do you think what do you think the odds are that that's realistic in the near or medium term to actually happen between Russia and Ukraine?
Look, as both Russia and Ukraine do not see or do not want this, and it would in Ukraine be extremely unpopular to do this, possibly, I don't even know. So I take this back. But I see the motivation of Russia and Ukraine to meet up for such talks as very low. But as Ukraine is, and this is a fact, it sounds horrible, but as Ukraine is completely dependent upon the West, and as Russia is very, very dependent politically, but also economically on China and Turkey, I think if the sides could be impressed upon by their respective allies or semi-allies to enter into such a small step process that would not mean giving up anything, that would not mean making any type of compromise, that would not mean losing, that would not mean capitulation, that would just mean to the creation of a forum, as you have done it before. As I said, in Istanbul, Ukrainian and Russian militaries are sitting in one room and are having conversations under the mediation of the UN about a grain initiative. So can this be extended? Would the pushback from Ukraine and Russia be so big that they say, no, if our allies or we want us to go into that room, we will not talk about Zaporizhzhia power plant. We will not talk about, I don't know what, hospitals, kindergartens. I don't think so. I think they would do it if the West would push for it. And that's not pushing, and I really don't want to be misunderstood, not pushing for a compromise or pushing for a defeat, but pushing for an entry into small level negotiations that can have great benefit.
Actually, okay, so. But briefly, please.
Just a quick comment that a successful result of negotiations during this war is the grain deal. That represents exactly what you're talking about with the mediation of the UN, something, both parts agreed on a ceasefire around one issue, but that's important for the world. But I also have a question. So you mentioned that the entire world is suffering because of the war, sacrificing something, yes, because of the, raising prices and this and that. Does that mean that if Ukraine and Russia sits down and talks and there is some kind of deal that the sanctions will be eased on Russia? Do you directly connect it, an agreement and easing sanctions? Because the world is suffering only because of the sanctions, not because there are bombs flying over their heads. It's directly related to the economic response.
I think that's a really good question, but I mean, I left my crystal ball in Brussels, but I will still try to answer you. There's two. Okay, we have 5 minutes for this. This is good. There's two things about the sanctions. Yeah. First of all, there is not one block of sanctions. There is like the sanctions. There's a whole bouquet of sanctions. Yeah. So, and the second thing is, and this is very often misunderstood, and I'm happy that I see a professor for EU here. These sanctions do not need a unanimity to lift them. They need a unanimity to extend them, right? So every 6 months, all the 27 member states have to decide we extend the sanctions. If Hungary says and Austria says, nah, we're not going to extend that package of sanctions, they're gone. Yeah. So that's a fragile, fickle, kind of legally fickle thing. So first of all, a bouquet. Secondly, they're kind of fickle in terms of legal securing. I think the sanctions, and it would make sense to lift the sanctions to the same degree that Russia provides for normalization and stabilization of the situation in Ukraine, right? So if Russia agrees to a humanitarian ceasefire around Zaporozhye, nobody's going to say, okay, now all the sanctions have to be lifted. No, but maybe one or two, if Russia agrees to, if the final result is something that's absolutely satisfying for everybody, which I see a very hard time seeing. But, you know, it doesn't need to be now. But if there is an agreement that would satisfy, not everybody will be happy, but that everybody, including the West, including China, including Russia, including Ukraine, will say, okay, we'll have to swallow that toad, as we say in German. I think you can imagine what that means. I think that's the moment to lift all the sanctions. Yes. But I believe also that the reintegration of Russia into the European security order is something that is necessary but impossible under Putin.
Okay, thank you. So please join me in thanking Wolfgang for that. Thank you. Thank you.